In the last episode, we have made multiple deployments in our project environments. But as you may guess, deployments they are different depending on the environment. As example, on the staging environment, I want to install all dependencies. Yet, on my Q&A environment or in my production environment, I want to install all dependencies except the dev dependencies. So, this type of commands that prepare your application for deployment are called the build hooks in Vapor. And build hooks are basically a set of commands that you want to run in your local machine to prepare your application for deployment. Let's see a real-world example with the npm command. So let's open first of all the package.json file to see the list of scripts. And as you can see, we have the traditional npm run development, but also the traditional npm run production. And the difference between those two commands is that the npm run dev gives you a good experience in terms of debugging if you have a JavaScript problem on the browser. But that doesn't happen with the npm run production because your build is optimized for production. Now, this is probably the type of commands that we want to be different in terms of our deployments and environments. So let's add, for example, this npm run production to our production environment, but also to our Q&A environment. Yet, for our staging environment, I want to use npm run development, as I want to have access to real-world debugging on the browser if something goes wrong in terms of JavaScript. So now let's make a new deployment so you can see how the build hooks output looks like when you make a deployment on Vapor. And we do that by typing Vapor deploy staging. Now, we already have talked about how verbose deployments are on Vapor. And with deploy hooks is no different. I can see all the output of my build hooks. For example, this is the output of Composer install, this is the output of PHP Artisan event cache, and this is the output of the command we just have added, npm run development. Now remember, those are called build hooks, and they are meant to run before the deployment in order to prepare your application to the deployment. So here you can see, for example, that we have run all those build hook commands before uploading the application to AWS. Now, how about commands that you want to run but after the deployment? And this is very common, for example, with the command php artisan migrate to migrate the database, which doesn't live locally, but it lives on the environment itself. To that, Vapor have the deploy hooks, and deploy hooks are run after uploading all your application to AWS. So here, for example, we can place the PHP Artisan migrate to migrate eventually the database that lives on the environment. And our application got deployed successfully. So now let's visit the vapor.yaml file to see what are exactly deploy hooks. So typically, the way that I like to see things is to place the deploy hooks just below the build hooks. So for example, here I have my build hooks which run before the deployment, and below I have my deploy hooks which run after the deployment. And again, this is the perfect place to place something like PHP Artisan migrate, which is supposed to run once my application is deployed, and I also want to run this command on the environment where the database lives. So now that we have added this deploy hook into our vapor.yaml file, let's run a new deployment to see what is the output from our deployment. So let's type Vapor deploy staging. Now, this time I do expect to see this deployment failing. And the reason is we are using the command php artisan migrate. The php artisan migrate is a database command that is supposed to run against a database that exists. We haven't created a database using Vapor yet, so for that reason the command will fail. So soon as we run the step called running deployment deployment hooks, I do expect to see the deployment failing. Let's wait a few extra seconds while our deployment is being made. And again, this type of hooks run after the deployment. That's why we saw our application being uploaded, and it's running the deployment hooks right now. And sure enough, we have a deployment hook that fails. That deployment hook is the migrate, as we have predicted. And we have also a clear message about what's going on, which is the connection refused to a database that doesn't exist. So let's fix this issue by going to the dashboard and creating a database resource to our staging environment. Once you click on databases, you can click on create database and introduce the name of the database. Here I'm going to put my staging database. And now we are going to do this. We are going to do this very quickly, but in the future we are going to get a full episode about databases in Vapor. I'm going to just specify that I want a maximum disk size of 25 gigabytes. I'm going to click on create, and I'm going to save those username and password for the future. Now, once the database is available, and keep in mind that this may take a few minutes depending on the environment and the specifications of the database, you can attach the database to the environment you want the database to be in. So let's do that by opening our vapor.yml file and head over to the staging environment, which is the environment that contains the php artisan migrate command, and just type database my staging database, which is basically the way of saying to Vapor, hey, I know that you have a database, call it my staging database, and I want to use that database within the staging environment. So now let's deploy our application, and I do expect to see a successful deployment. So let's type Vapor deploy staging. And while our deployment is being done, let's recap a little bit this episode. In this episode, we have talked about two types of hooks. We have talked about the hooks who run before the deployment, and those are the build hooks, such as npm run development. The build hooks are meant to run before the deployment to prepare your application for the deployment. Therefore, they run before the uploading of your application to AWS. But sometimes you might want to run hooks when your application is on the environment already, and those are called the deploy hooks. And the typical use case for this might be the php artisan migrate command, which concerns the database that lives on the environment itself already. So soon as a step running deployment hooks appears, I do expect this step to pass successfully, which will be the case very soon. There we go. And our deployment will be completed successfully as well very soon. And sure enough, the deployment got completed successfully. And that's it for this episode. On the next episode, we are going to talk about runtimes, because so far we have said that we can change the PHP version, but sometimes you may need a little bit more than that, such as installing a PHP extension.